And so, I was observing what was happening. And then after that, that July 4th, 94 incident I realized this is it, it's now or never. It really was one of those moments. You hear about those moments, but it was me realizing I'm living in this squat. I've got a pet ferret. My girlfriend's gone. She broke up with me. She was smart enough to break up with me. At that point, I just made the decision. I just said, okay, look, I'm not gonna be a professional athlete. I think I'm pretty good at memorizing things. I think I have an interest in people. I'm going to just decide. I just decided to do school. I decided that was the track. So like some people pick the military because it's like if you know what to expect, at least in terms of the passages that you're going to go through. And for me, that was school. And so I decided to get back in school. I moved into a studio apartment by myself. I quit partying completely. I didn't go to parties. I got really serious about fitness. So I just started running and lifting weights. And I studied.
You went like Henry Rollins style.
I did.
Yeah.
I did.
That's a lot of self-awareness, I mean, people go into the military because on some level, some people do because there's some yearning for having that structure imposed upon their lives. But you constructed that kind of structure for yourself.
Yeah, I think I was really afraid. I think I was like, and these days, because my lab studies fear and I get into this whole thing around mindsets, people always ask me like, is it better to do something from a place of love or fear? Like, it depends. And at that point, fear was the best motivator for me. And I just basically worked like crazy. And it's interesting because I didn't have a mentor or someone to bring me to that. But once I started doing that, there was one professor in particular who took note. He was like, oh, you seemed really interested in this stuff. And I was like, yeah, because he was teaching me about depression, schizophrenia, neurochemicals. I thought I was totally turned on by the world of neuroscience. It wasn't even called neuroscience back then, but this one guy, Harry Carlisle, he was teaching me about thermal regulation and how the brain works and how receptors in the skin relate to perceptions in the mind. And he also had a deep sensitivity to mental disease. And I'd seen a lot of that. I'd seen a lot of depression and anxiety in my own family. I'd had a friend commit suicide, another friend become schizophrenic. I think he's still walking the Mission District of San Francisco now. Seen some friends become addicts. And so here was someone explaining that there's actually an underlying basis for this. And I just poured myself into it.
Is that the same guy who would smoke underneath the vacuum hood and stuff like that, like a bit of an iconoclast?
Yeah, he was amazing. So he was a favorite teacher of many students, but if you could get into his lab, then you were kind of one of the chosen ones, I guess.
He's like the perfect mentor at the perfect time for you.
Yeah, so he used to drink coffee in lab, which you're not supposed to do. He used to smoke cigarettes in lab and in the fume hood, and they used to come and yell at him, and he would do it anyway. And I thought, this guy, he doesn't even know what it is, but he's a punk rocker, he doesn't even know. And so, he gave me an opportunity to work in his lab, and then at some point he told me, if you go to graduate school, they'll actually pay you to do science. And what ended up happening at that point was I hit a brick wall because I had a lot of resentment toward my dad. I felt, here's my dad, he was a scientist, he had, left us, all this kind of thing. And I realized if I didn't do this, if I didn't take this opportunity, it was gonna be the most foolish thing ever. What am I gonna do, spite my, my parents, because, I was 20 years old at that point. So I just made the decision, I'm gonna get a PhD, I'm gonna become a professor, I'm gonna get tenure, I'm gonna be like this guy. This guy who looked like he had a pretty good life to me. And so that's pretty much how I spent the last 25 years of my life is doing experiments.
It worked out.
It worked out. I mean, it was a lot of work. I mean, I didn't have the power of concentration. I hadn't read all the good books that gun high school students read growing up. I had to learn how to speak properly. I learned how to think properly and really learn how to commit to something that was very linear and at times was very painful. And I went to some pretty extreme things. I actually used to set a timer and I wouldn't allow myself to get out of the chair until the timer went off.
Right.
So, and I would experience extreme agitation. But over time, I got pretty good. And now I can do long stints of work without any breaks. And it worked out.
You developed that neuroplasticity in your favor, ultimately. You were always a reader, though, right?
I loved books. So I would, I would hide in the Tower Books section in the evenings, and I would read everything about fitness, psychology, anything I could. I've always devoured information. My favorite book when I was a kid was the Encyclopedia or the Guinness Book of World Records. So I would, like, when I was a little kid, I'd walk around the Aspen Center for Physics and I would tell anyone. I didn't even ask them if they wanted to hear about, like, what's the world's smallest eutherian mammal. You know, I would like, it could tell you all these facts that were kind of meaningless at the time, but I've always been fascinated by the inventory of different animals on the planet and their different behaviors. And so, yeah, voracious reader, and still now.
Yeah,
I love information.
Well, as a neuroscientist, I mean, you're your own patient. I mean, the fact that you were able to, you know, turn your life around in such a dramatic fashion and do it essentially through sheer will and, you know, setting up practices that would fuel you in that right direction, and then being available when those mentors showed up from the you know, the early therapist. It sounds like that guy almost saved your life.
He absolutely
right?
saved my life.
Yeah.
He gave me the book, Wherever You Go, There You Are, the John Kabat-Zinn book. And he said, no pressure, but if you can develop a mindfulness practice where you can sit still for like 10 minutes a day, it'll serve you very well. So I started doing that. Like he could have told me to hang out of a window by my ankles. I would have done it. I think there was a self-preservation thing was kicking in for me. So I got very interested in mindfulness meditation. He also, it was, I think, quite smart in saying, look, there's a whole world of psychedelic drugs that are powerful in influencing the mind. He said, if you're going to explore those, wait until your brain has already developed, which I think is a controversial statement in and of itself. He actively discouraged me to go down that path, which I think was the right thing, given I was a minor, you know. And nowadays there's all this discussion now about psychedelics and their power, and I think they are very interesting compounds, but he really steered me towards behavioral practices. Like, what could I do each day from waking up to going to sleep that would serve my mental health and my productivity well?
Right.
Yeah, I owe him a tremendous amount, and especially because he wasn't just in the psychoanalytic theory, he also was like cognitive behavioral. He understood the power of practices, not just discussing issues.
Yeah, to begin a meditation practice at that age in the mid-90s, that's pretty radical.
Yeah, I felt it was funny because I thought if I didn't sit in the lotus position, like I wasn't doing it properly. You know, back then there was all this stuff around. It was very mystical. And in my family, because my dad's very conservative and my mom's a little bit more of a free spirit, I was taught that anything that related to hippie culture was doomed to fail and cause problems, and that anything that was related to like conservative culture was fated to advance the progress of humanity.
Right.
And it turned out neither one was true, of course. But I needed people to push me in those directions. Lift weights, run, meditate, do your schoolwork, do your homework. And so I think now I have a good relationship with my parents, but I think I had to go out into the world and find those sort of paternal and maternal figures because they weren't in my home.